We are now moving on to Erikson, who gives us the psychosocial framework on the formation of identity, or how we are going to walk in this life. And of course, we've had the grounding for that in all of our previous theorists, but especially in Adler. Maybe he was the most grounded in like that square, the living of life on this earth, and Erikson follows that trajectory. A quote from Erikson: "The sense of identity provides the ability to experience oneself as something that has continuity and sameness, and to act accordingly." Or in other words, to have a sense of coherence within yourself. So Erikson was a man who really struggled with identity throughout his life. He was born in Germany in 1902. His mother was Jewish, and that was a hard time to be Jewish. And even complicating things more for him, he didn't know his father, which was really pretty rare at that time. And he didn't look like the rest of his family, so he felt like an outsider, like he didn't know who he was. And he spent much of his young adulthood searching for his father. At one point, he became convinced that his father was from Denmark and that he was an artistic Danish man, and went searching for him. And that led him on his own path of arts, where he wandered around through Europe for a 7-year period. So he really was searching. Eventually, he went for psychoanalysis by Anna Freud. Anna, as you may remember, I think from your first chapter, she was introduced as Sigmund Freud's daughter. And so he went to her for Freudian approach to psychoanalysis, and she told him he needed to stop spending his life searching for his dad. That is Anna Freud with Sigmund Freud, her father. So at that juncture, he just switched everything. He moved to America, and this maybe is the story of a lot of the intruders into the American scene. He abandoned his Jewish identity. He didn't know his father, so he changed his name from his stepfather's name to Erikson in America, and just came to unroot himself from everything he had known and find himself uniquely as an individual. When he first moved, he lived with 2 different Native American tribes, the Sioux in South Dakota and the Yurok of Southern California. This is a photo he took of some of the children in the Sioux tribe that he lived with in the early part of the 20th century, and they really influenced him. But however, eventually he met his wife, Joan, and they had many decades of a very happy marriage. She was a wise partner who influenced a lot of his ideas. And notably, he never got himself an academic degree. He never even got his bachelor's degree. And yet he was, at that time, there were less stringent degree requirements, and so he was hired at Harvard despite that, because of his wisdom, his insight, the legitimate life searching he had done as he wandered. And so he became a professor of human development at Harvard in 1960. He died in Cape Cod in 1994, and his wife, Joan, even continued his work to the development of a last stage of the human life, which Erikson himself had an indirect role in as the one that she observed in those last days of life. So in answering the question of how we develop a personality, he thought that our ego existed as a potential to move us through this life. And it was developed, our egos, our sense of self, our identities, are developed through our culture and our environment. And that we develop our personalities in order to adapt to our culture. So that's dependent on the needs and values of our culture. He also became aware that we are all we view ourselves as pseudo-species, species that look like species, we feel like species, but we're really not. But nevertheless, it's an illusion held by social culture that each culture feels that it's like the chosen species, the best, the ones, the people. And that causes all kinds of tensions between us. And so if we have this belief, think about how you would behave if you believe that your tribe, your group, your clan, your people, your community are the best, the ones who most deserve to survive. Well, you might really fight on behalf of your tribe, but in the face of like global warfare, or in the face of like the fact that we're actually part of a larger body of humanity or even a larger body of life, that kind of ethnocentric belief can be maladaptive. They harm us in the end. We can even see that today in the kinds of international tensions and conflicts that we're having that are stemmed around this maladaptive belief that more in some cultures than others, that we are the best. And that's a kind of a problematic belief that emerges to shape us. So he talks about the epigenetic principle, but I want you to note that he doesn't use this word the way we know about it today. When we get to the chapter on biology, when we go back to the Friedman and Shustak textbook that you bought, we'll learn a little bit about epigenetics, that is the changing of the expression of the genome based on lived experience. But he was thinking about it more metaphorically, which is also apt, that each of us has within us a blueprint for what our life should be, but how does it actually turn out? And so let's look at this seed that has just sprouted. Well, there is a blueprint in this seed as it searches its way through the soil to find its root and eventually becomes a plant. The first crisis that this seed has to go through is to find out if he can trust the seed can trust the environment to provide water. And then there's another crisis. Can I dare to open? Can I trust enough to expose myself to the sun? Can I reach for the light? Can I flourish? Can I reproduce? Or is my environment not supportive of my flourishing? And then I should languish or close off my ability to participate in life. And so we might say that these are the equivalent of the interaction between the potential within the seed and then the way the environment interacts with it to determine what the plant actually becomes. So epi means above, genetic is heredity. Once again, he didn't have knowledge. At his time, the science hadn't advanced far enough to know about epigenetic principles in the biology of genetics, but yet he knew, quoting him, every organism is born with a certain purpose and continues to develop how it was intended to in interrelation with its environment. Another quote, we develop through a predetermined unfolding of our personalities in conjunction with environmental influences. And so once again, we have a tree that has a genetic blueprint dictating that will be an elm tree or a cottonwood or whatever it is intended to be. But the way it determines actually depends on its environment. If someone comes in and puts a clothesline around it at this stage and forgets to remove it, well, then it'll be truncated right at that juncture. Or if there's a larger tree next to it, then its growth will be limited because of an absence of sun. Or if it grows up during a drought, that will impact it. Or if there's a house right next to it, then it won't grow on this side. And so all of those things impact the tree, but he would say similarly, all of those things impact us. So Erikson brings us the 8 stages of man, and these are stages that you have probably encountered either in lifespan human development class or intro to psych or some other class. But they're basically developmental crises that are reckoned with at different life stages. And you can see he has a lot of these reckonings happening, or these crises happening in childhood and adolescence, and then a few of them happening in adulthood and later adulthood. So we can think of 7 key principles underlying Erikson's thinking. So first is the epigenetic principle. Each stage arises in interrelation to the events and situations of the previous stage. Next, we can talk about an interaction of opposites. So at each stage of development, and he does have 8 stages that you probably learned about in one of your other classes, each stage has like a conflict that needs to be resolved, or what he calls a crisis. And there's both a syntonic, meaning like a harmonious, a smooth, something that fosters the path, and a dystonic, or a disruptive element. And kind of a finding of the middle road is what is needed for each of these crisis areas in order to walk a balanced life. He talks about basic strength, how each the crisis at each stage of life produces an ego duality, and that duality is called a basic strength. So as we resolve it, that's what emerges. That if we don't develop enough basic strength at any one stage, then that individual develops a core pathology, which is just a challenge that they may need to work with in their lifetime. Biology plays a role. Even though his focus was on the social environment in which these things occur, he recognized that we do have a blueprint, and he thought of it as a biological blueprint. He saw these things as non-linear, like if we have a crisis at any one developmental stage, it would be influenced by a multiplicity of past, present, and anticipated events. So it's not quite a straight line in life as we might sometimes think of our development and growth. And finally, each stage is essentially about identity, finding who we are. So each stage is like a turning point in a person's life, but this is most salient, most important, most pivotal at adolescence, when we're finding our adult roles and the way we're going to fit into the world. So the first stage in infancy is the crisis of trust versus mistrust. Erikson pens this at around birth to 18 months, the same as Freud's oral stage of development. And he says the basic strength that emerges from a successful resolution is hope and drive, like the willingness to walk forward in this world. And trust is the syntonic or the harmonious state versus mistrust, which is dystonic. It's non-harmonious, it's an obstacle. But once again, he stresses, Erikson always stresses that we need balance. We need both. If someone has too much trust, really they can be taken advantage of. So there needs to be a little bit of balance. And he does link this to Freud's oral sensory stage, receiving and accepting information. Like we receive air and sensory information, and we incorporate, we find out how to get someone to give to us what we need. And quoting Erikson, when we enter a situation, we must differentiate between how much we can trust and how much we must mistrust or be ready for danger or anticipation of discomfort. So it gives this kind of hope and, like a foundation to walk through this life. So the stage 2 crisis is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this takes place in those toddler years, around 18 months to 3 years. And if you think about what 2-year-olds are doing, the most common word that comes to mind might be no. And that's the child's assertion of their own will. That's this establishment of autonomy. And it comes along with Freud's anal stage, where he most certainly recognizes that no parent can make a child control their movements, their evacuations, their release of stool or urine. That's nothing that the parent can control. The child alone controls it. So it's the perfect manifestation of this mode in alignment with what Freud said. So children learn to master their bodies and to assert their will. And at this stage, no is a common word. A child might rebel. Hopefully they aren't just defying compulsively. And parents, of course, walk this fine line between letting their child have appropriate choices and also constraining their behaviors for the sake of safety and just for the learning that we are all constrained. So the duality here, the syntonic state, is autonomy. The child can assert their will, and that teaches them to manage their failures as well if there's a nice balance in there. The dystonic state is shame and doubt. The child hesitates and doubts their strengths, and they'll be destroyed by their own failures. And so as parents navigate and walk this fine line, Erikson suggests that the majority of times the parents should grant autonomy. They should make many choices that are reasonable for the child and safe, so that the child can develop this sense of will and the sense that, yes, they can control their bodies. And then it should be balanced out with constraint, maybe representing these laws of society that we all have to adhere to. So in stage 3, this is the preschool years, initiative versus guilt. That's the play age. Play is very important for forming those social dynamics. And the purpose that's gained in this stage is the sense of purpose is what is gained during that stage. The ability to enact adult processes of their own volition, take the initiative, take action to move forward in their lives, self-advocate, things like that. Genital locomotor stage. At this age, children do understand male-female differences, and there's a lot of movement involved in the play. And so the crisis then, initiative, they need to be able to select and pursue goals. And sometimes when a child, as you can see in the picture on the left, the mom could probably get the cooking done quicker without the child's help. And, maybe picking up the sheep and carrying them is a helpful thing, but maybe it's also getting in the way. But it's really appropriate for parents to, encourage those things to help the child develop a strong sense of that they can take the initiative, they can take actions. And if they don't, if they're never given the opportunity, or if their efforts to take the initiative are always reprimanded, then they're going to feel guilty. Like that their goals aren't right, like that they shouldn't be doing those things, or if their goals are disregarded all the time. And so it's really important for young children to have goals and to act on them. But as always, some balance is appropriate, because there's always a need for balance in life, and that trains, if we're speaking in Freud's language, that would train a nice strong ego in the middle, weighing out when it's appropriate to take the initiative and when not. And the best way to do that would be through proximal, being near the child as they're doing kinds of things, and of course play with peers, but just being around and engaging with children a lot. So the stage 4 crisis is industry versus inferiority. And here in the images on the right, you can see children who are working hard. The top child at school, the middle child helping the family by chopping wood, the third one taking care of the family pet. Industry, hard work, that's what this is about. So the typical ages is 6 to 12 years, the elementary school years. And the duality here, the syntonic state is industry, which is just effort and hard work that yields success. And the dystonic state is inferiority, doubt that a person's effort will yield good outcomes or gain approval. And of course, we don't want someone to reside in this state. There we have Adler's inferiority complex that can emerge at this stage. The source of affirmation at this juncture are mostly teachers. This is a really important source of affirmation, but also leaders of an organization, a sports team or something like that, or parents, any adult primarily who's in charge of encouraging children to work hard at something, whether it's sport or a chore or schoolwork, and so that their work pays off. It yields competence is the basic strength. The child learns that their effort leads to successful performance, skill development, and approval, and the sense that they are competent if they work hard can last a child a lifetime. So we do need a balance. Industry is syntonic, but we need to have a balance. A child needs to sometimes be inferior, not be as successful as another person, and that both leads them to strive to achieve more, which can be a good thing. But it also keeps a person, humble, not getting too grand on themselves. So here, these key adults need to be able to find tasks for the child, whether they're chores, schoolwork, or sports skills that are challenging. The child should have to work, but also achievable. So tasks that are too hard, too far out of reach, that will lead to a sense of the child giving up. They just can't do it. But tasks that are too easy, the child never has to work out and always gets approved in success, well, that can lead to a failure to learn to work hard and an inability to cope with failure when it eventually does come, as well as perhaps a sense of arrogance as well. So in adulthood, what we want then is cooperative participation in adult life, as opposed to inertia, which means you're kind of still and failing to move forward. So that's what we would see. So the stage 5 crisis is identity versus identity diffusion. So we're looking at the teen years in Erikson's day, although we should put a lens on this by observing that many people married fairly young in Erikson's day, and so 18 really was quite more of a monumental step toward adulthood than it is today. Often adolescence is prolonged today. So this is the period of adolescence where one is finding one's role in the adult world. And the basic strength is identity, fidelity, or coherence, a coherent, grounded sense of who one is. So the syntonic state then is identity, fidelity, and that's just the arrival at a coherent state of who you are, what your values are, who your people are, where you fit into the adult world. And that's the outcome, the syntonic state, the harmonious state. And Erikson stresses that this should be achieved through exploration of various roles and personae, like that an adolescent who's exploring, a punk rock thing or something like that. Well, he says that's appropriate, that if we don't explore, we can't ever really find out who we are. And the dystonic state is identity confusion. And this might be part of failure to launch, as we might say it today. The child never does step into an adult world. They feel uncertain of themselves. They don't know their place in the world. They don't know what their goals are, their job are. Their self-image might be divided among many different, say, social groups or identities. And they may not just put on different persona for different groups, but they actually may feel themselves a different person. There's not a core inside themselves that they can rely on. And so that's a lot of self-doubt. And then that also prevents committing to certain values or committing to goals or to direction or even committing to other individuals in later intimate relationships. So Erikson says some confusion is necessary, but if there's too much, that leads to postponement of adult responsibilities and just a sort of a drifting state without any goals, just bobbing from one thing to the next. The source of affirmation here are often peers. Of course, teens want approval from, adults. That's not a bad thing, but the more important source is peers. Those are the ones with whom every one of us would walk through our lives, those who are in our same age cohort. And so that becomes a big part of how the direction is found. And those peers are what leads us to either affirm or repudiate our childhood identifications. So our peers, what they're doing are what other teens tend to do. And then it also allows a young person to locate themselves within a historical context, like Gen Z, all involved in the COVID situation or dealing with social media in a certain way, or maybe people in the generation just a bit older than me, who had the Vietnam War as very much of a defining characteristic of that generation. And peers were a big part of that identity. And so even here, even though identity coherence is excellent, we still need to have balance. So life changes, and if a person gets too rigidly locked into an identity, then they can't flex as the world changes, as life changes, as relationships change, as jobs change. So there's some flexibility needed, even though we don't want someone who's drifting and confused. So just examining this dystonic state a little bit more, identity confusion can manifest in role repudiation. Role repudiation just means the prolonged inability of an adolescent to establish a stable identity, refusal to accept adult responsibilities, roles, or intimacy. And that may manifest as either diffidence, which is like always subjecting, never feeling certain enough in yourself to take a direction, but always like deferring or seeking input or only acting if it's under the guidance of someone who's older, like an adult. So it could manifest as shyness and hesitancy or really extreme self-consciousness or withdrawal or apathy, and it might be accompanied by sort of aimless drifting from one job to the next. This diffidence I have read about appearing in some members of Gen Z who have maybe had parents who overprotect, And in this case, even going to college, the parents are kind of coming along with them and checking with their professors. And so this can really interfere with young people's ability to launch. But it can also manifest as the opposite, as defiance, stubborn allegiance to socially unacceptable beliefs and practices, not just as a means of trying on a different identity, but specifically because they're unacceptable. And so it's this blatant rejection or violations of social norms, including law violations and that sort of thing, substance abuse or adherence to an antisocial group like a cult or a biker gang or something like that, or extreme cynicism, not wanting to participate in the political system or the other organizations that are part of the culture. So Erikson would place both of these as a type of role repudiation, a refusal to step into one's adult responsibilities. The stage 6 crisis is intimacy versus isolation, and this takes place in the young adult years, which is a typical age for forging your long-term enduring relationships, whether that is marriage or those long-term committed friendships. The basic strength is love, and we won't think of this as falling in love, which is an unstable, fragile, dopamine-driven state, but we'll think about the ability to love, encompassing both the vulnerability of trust and sharing of your own personal vulnerabilities, and then also accepting those imperfections in another person, not putting them on a pedestal, but accepting them as they are. And so the syntonic state is intimacy, and that is your ability to fuse your identity with that of another person without being afraid of losing who you are. You can only do that if you have a stable identity. If you don't, then Erikson would suggest that your identity is too fragile to tolerate true intimacy. So in its mature state, it would involve things like shared trust, sacrifice for another person, compromise, giving up some of what you want for another person, committing to them through thick and thin, navigating sexual aspects of your adult life, and friendship. Hopefully in that intimate relationship, most intimate relationship, there's also a friendship. And Erikson suggests that both people need to retain a separate identity and not consume the other fully into their own identity. The dystonic state is isolation. One lacks the capacity to actually share true intimacy. And it often stems from an unstable identity. If your identity is unstable, it would be difficult for you would feel that you were compromising your identity if you were truly intimate. It's, as mentioned, it's a bit fragile. And it might manifest as, a lack of intimate relationship or like meaningless sexual encounters. And the basic strength is love. That's redundant there. The balance is that an individual in their mature state must be able to tolerate both intimacy and isolation, because in that truly the ability to be intimate means that you're not always with that other person, and so you have to be able to be alone with yourself as well in this Erikson's view. He also points out that pathological exclusivity, by which he means the feeling that you must own another person, or if there's a relationship where one partner inhibits or prevents the other person from having from having an outside life or having other friendships, that's pathological exclusivity, being devoted to only that one person. And he says that's the opposite of love. It blocks your ability to cooperate, compete, or compromise, and it stems from deep insecurity that might be coming from unsuccessful resolution of earlier stages. And then finally, generativity versus stagnation. That's in those retirement years, 30 to 50. And pro-creativity, creativity for the benefit of next generations. The word here is generativity, not generosity. It could include generosity and likely does, but generativity actually means paying attention to what's going to be there, what you're giving to the next generation, with its opposite being stagnation, like a sense of stillness. The energy has stopped and stagnated within you. It's not flowing to the next generation. And so that can be generated in many ways, both in giving, to one's grandchildren or youth in the community, or just back to the community in general, or through creative endeavors that will be passed on. Many ways to have that kind of to have that kind of generativity. So generating new beings, new products, new ideas, new whatever it is that you're going to move onward, At this juncture, it's usually no longer enough to just have that one intimate partnership. Now there's a more large embracing of next generations, so a more involvement in the outer world beyond just that one relationship. So the dystonic state is stagnation and self-absorption. So self-indulgence that exceeds what is needed for growth. So someone who's always, taking themselves on, big vacations, or getting things for themselves, buying more products for themselves, having more than we need generally does not lead to happiness. Having what we need can lead to happiness, but having more than we need doesn't, and usually giving gives more. So that's the dystonic state. The basic strength then is caring about those around you, about the next generation. It rests on previous strengths, and it feels like a natural desire, not a duty or an obligation. It's what the person wants to do. And lastly, integrity versus despair. Integrity meaning one can look back on their life with a sense that the life it's had its good days and bad days, but all in all, it's been lived with honesty. And the person doesn't look back with just regret or despair, and the basic strength is wisdom. And this is an old age. And as I mentioned, or perhaps I didn't mention, Erikson's wife, they were together many decades. And after Erikson wrote these 8 stages, this is where he ended, and this is where he stopped his life work. But later, as he got even older than this age, his wife observed in both of them that they became more spiritual. And as he lost the ability to write, she wrote the very last chapter that she called spiritual gero transcendence, meaning that when people get very old, they kind of rise above the earthly needs and enter into more of a spiritual state. It's not usually, that stage 9 is not usually included in Erikson's work, but I think his wife was very insightful in recognizing this great gift of the very old. So just to close this lecture, we'll talk more about this, but we can remember that identity formation, each stage builds on the next. So Erikson would posit that if we successfully resolve this trust versus mistrust stage, then we're in a good position to master the autonomy versus shame and doubt. And that subsequently leads to a good grounding, that sense of will that leads to this successful resolution of initiative versus guilt, a sense of purpose. And that leads to a good foundation for learning that your hard work pays off and developing a sense of competence as you resolve the crisis of industry versus inferiority. And that leads a foundation for this identity stage, leading to good intimacy, leading to a desire to generate for future generations, and a sense of wisdom at the end of, nearing the end of one's life. But he recognizes, just even as his own life didn't flow in a straight line, he recognizes that it would be rare indeed for any human being to have master all of these stages. And it often is the work of our life to find our way mastering these one at a time, even out of sequence, even when we're older. And so if you were in a situation where you didn't have the opportunity to learn to get hope through the mastery of the crisis trust versus mistrust when you were a baby, because maybe, your parents, maybe your mom was struggling with depression, or, your family was in some other kind of struggle and they weren't able to be there to give that to you. Well, you don't need to give up, because it's the work of a lifetime for all of us to resolve these things as we can. And so I think Erikson gives us a nice gift in this model. So as we think about all of what Erikson offered to us, we can now go beyond where Erikson took us and think about the many levels of identity that each of us has. So we all have identity within, we have to reckon with identity within our race and ethnicity, identity within our gender, sexual orientation and sex, identity within our particular socioeconomic status, whatever it is, or within our religion, identity within our age cohort, identity with our physical, emotional trait, our physical, emotional characteristics, and if we have any developmental disabilities, how are we identifying that? If we struggle with something like anxiety or depression, how are we reckoning with that, and are we making it identity where it shouldn't be? We have to figure out what our language is, what our first language is, and come to identify how are we going to experience that in ourselves or our national origin. And there are many more levels. We generally find that one, for example, our sex, our male or female, becomes important primarily when we're in the opposite sex. Our race becomes more important when we're within other races, especially if we're a minority. And so dealing with all of it just doesn't mean dealing with it in one setting, but across settings. So dealing with who you are, where you're from, what your status is, what your age is, what your faith is, within all of the different settings where you might emerge. And so there's lots to do with finding your identity, and undoubtedly it will change throughout your life as these things change for you. So coherence can be a complex process. So to end this little piece on Erikson, think about this idea. As you listen to this framework, did any of these stages stand out for you? Did you, for example, think back when you were listening to the autonomy versus shame and doubt, and think about how you were never allowed to make decisions, and maybe you thought about how maybe that explains how today you don't seem to have a lot of will or determination, like you feel like your willpower is weak or something like that. Or maybe during your adolescent years you were constrained from finding different identities. Maybe you were very busy working or supporting younger children, and you never really did have a chance to find out who you were or what you were about. Or maybe you came from a home situation where you didn't have caregivers that you could trust. And so, or maybe you're fortunate and you felt that you had a strong foundation in all of these levels, and you can write a piece about how grateful you are for the people who created that for you. And so you could write something about this for a piece of your journal entry this week as you reflect on Erikson.